The morning sun filtered through the half-empty mansion's windows as Emily Hartman watched her ex-husband Richard pack the last of his belongings. The marble floors echoed with each step he took, carrying designer suits and expensive watches. Moving boxes lined the walls of their once-shared bedroom, each one marked with precise labels in Richard's controlled handwriting. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her tailored business pseudo-armor against the vulnerability she felt inside. At 42, she had rebuilt her corporate empire, but the emotional toll of their marriage lingered. Richard moved with his usual calculated grace, occasionally glancing at her with that practiced smile that had once charmed investors and eventually manipulated her life for 15 years. "The movers will handle the rest," Richard announced, adjusting his Rolex. His voice carried that familiar condescending tone that Emily had finally learned to recognize. "I trust you'll maintain the property well. It would be a shame to see it decline." The implied criticism wasn't lost on Emily. Later that evening, Emily sat in her home office with Sarah Matthews, her closest friend since college. The room still held traces of Richard's presence: the antique desk he'd chosen, the pretentious oil paintings he'd insisted were crucial for maintaining their image. "I can't believe I didn't see it earlier," Emily confided, her fingers wrapped around an untouched glass of wine. "Every business decision I made, he questioned. Every success I had, he somehow made it about his guidance, his influence." Sarah leaned forward, concern evident in her expression. "The gaslighting was subtle at first, wasn't it?" "So subtle," Emily agreed, standing to pace the room. "He'd suggest I was overreacting when I confronted him about flirting with clients. He convinced me I was paranoid when I questioned his late nights at the office. Then came the financial manipulation, insisting on joint accounts, questioning every independent investment I made." Sarah watched as Emily moved to the window, overlooking the extensive gardens. "When did you finally realize it wasn't you?" "The Cooper deal," Emily replied, her voice stronger now. "When I landed it independently, he spent weeks trying to convince everyone it was his connections that made it happen. That's when I saw the pattern clearly. How he'd systematically undermine my confidence while maintaining this perfect public image." The next morning, seeking solace, Emily wandered into her neglected garden. The roses had withered, the hedges grown wild, a reflection of her own ignored needs during the marriage. That's when she first noticed Marcus Green, the new gardener recommended by her property manager. He worked with quiet focus, his hands moving with purpose as he pruned dead branches and cleared overgrown paths. Unlike Richard's calculating precision, Marcus's movements showed genuine care for the plants he tended. His dark skin glistened with honest work under the California sun, a stark contrast to Richard's artificially maintained country club tan. "The garden needs time to heal," Marcus said when he noticed her watching. "Some plants, when they've been neglected, need gentle care to come back to life." The simple wisdom in his words struck Emily deeply. Over the next few weeks, Emily found herself spending more time in the garden. Marcus taught her about nurturing growth, about patience and recovery. Their conversations, starting with plants and gradually expanding to life experiences, became a daily ritual. He spoke of his own challenges, his journey from Chicago to California, his love for transforming neglected spaces into places of beauty. "Everything has its own time to bloom," Marcus told her one morning as they planted new roses together. "You can't force it, can't rush it. You just provide the right conditions and trust the process." Emily realized these conversations were healing something in her that Thera, PY and friends couldn't reach. Here was a man who saw strength in gentleness, who understood that growth required both care and space. The contrast with Richard's controlling nature couldn't have been starker. As spring progressed, Emily felt herself beginning to change. She started making decisions without second-guessing herself, rediscovered her passion for innovative business strategies, and slowly learned to trust her own judgment again. The garden, under Marcus's care, began to show signs of revival, much like its owner. The California spring had fully blossomed when Emily suggested having lunch in the garden. She carried a simple wicker basket filled with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and homemade lemonade, a far cry from the elaborate catered affairs Richard had always insisted upon. Marcus sat with her on the checkered blanket, his work gloves set aside, looking slightly uncertain about this shift in their dynamic. "I've never had a client invite me to lunch before," he admitted, accepting the sandwich Emily offered. His hands, calloused from years of working with plants, contrasted with the delicate china plate she'd brought out. "I'm not very good at following social protocols anymore," Emily replied, surprising herself with her candor. "I spent 15 years letting someone else dictate every social interaction. It's refreshing to just be." They talked for hours that afternoon. Marcus shared stories about growing up on Chicago's South Side, where his mother maintained a community garden despite limited resources. Emily spoke about building her technology company from scratch, before Richard had entered her life and gradually taken control of her narrative. From the street, partially hidden behind tinted windows of his Mercedes, Richard watched the scene unfold. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as he observed Emily's uninhibited laughter, something he hadn't heard in years. The sight of her sitting on the ground, shoes off, sharing a meal with the gardener, made his jaw clench. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, pulling out his phone to make a call. The sight of Emily, his Emily, behaving so beneath her station sparked a familiar need to regain control. The following week, Emily invited Marcus to dinner at her house. She'd cooked herself, another act of independence that would have horrified Richard, who'd insisted on professional chefs for every meal. As they shared a simple pasta dish, Marcus told her about his dreams of starting a landscape architecture firm focused on sustainable, drought-resistant designs. "You're full of surprises," Emily said, genuinely impressed by his knowledge of environmental business practices. "Why haven't you started yet?" "Banks aren't exactly eager to loan money to someone like me," Marcus replied without bitterness. "And most investors expect certain connections." Emily recognized the familiar barriers of privilege she'd benefited from but never fully acknowledged before. Their conversation deep into the night, touching on dreams, fears, and the subtle prejudices that shaped their different worlds. The pivotal moment came when Emily decided to introduce Marcus to her mother, Catherine Hartman, a fixture of San Francisco's elite social circle. The meeting took place at Catherine's Pacific Heights mansion, where every surface gleamed with old money and judgment. Catherine's reaction was swift and cutting. "Really, Emily," she said, barely waiting for Marcus to leave the room. "I understand you're going through some kind of rebellion after Richard, but this is taking it too far. What will people say?" "People?" Emily countered, feeling a surge of protective anger. "The same people who watched Richard systematically undermine me for years and said nothing?" "That was different," Catherine insisted. "Richard is one of us. He understands our world. This gardener, no matter how well-spoken he might be, will never fit in. Think of your position in society, your comp, any image." The confrontation with her mother forced Emily to examine her own ingrained prejudices. She prided herself on being progressive, yet found herself questioning whether she was ready to face the social consequences of loving someone society deemed inappropriate. That evening, as she watched Marcus tend to the garden's night-blooming jasmine, Emily realized something fundamental had shifted. The carefully constructed walls of her privileged world were crumbling, replaced by something more authentic and alive. "Your mother wasn't exactly subtle," Marcus said quietly, not looking up from his work. "No, she wasn't," Emily agreed, moving to help him with the pruning. "But I'm not exactly subtle either. I'm falling in love with you, Marcus Green, and I don't care what anyone thinks about it." The words hung in the evening air, honest and unstoppable. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her previous life seem like a pale imitation of living. "Are you sure?" he asked, not about her feelings, but about everything those feelings would mean in their worlds. Emily's answer was to kiss him. Right there in the garden, they'd brought back to life together. Unknown to them, Richard's private investigator captured the moment from the street, setting in motion a chain of events that would test their newfound love against the full force of society's prejudices and Richard's wounded pride. In his downtown San Francisco office, Richard Hartman examined the manila envelope his private investigator had just delivered. The leather of his executive chair creaked as he leaned forward, spreading photographs across his mahogany desk. Each image showed Emily and Marcus together, in the garden, at local restaurants, walking along the beach at sunset. "Tell me what you found, Jensen," Richard demanded, his manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. The investigator cleared his throat. "Marcus Green, age 35, born and raised in Chicago's South Side. His father was killed in a convenience store robbery when Marcus was 12. Mother died of cancer 5 years ago. He put himself through community college studying horticulture while working 3 jobs." Richard's lip curled slightly. "Criminal record?" "One arrest at age 19 during a protest against police brutality. Charges were dropped. He spent 6 months in juvenile detention at 16 for being in a stolen car, but records suggest he was an unwitting passenger. Clean record since then. Financial status? Lives in a modest apartment in Oakland. No major debts, but no significant assets either. Attempted to secure business loans multiple times for a landscape architecture firm. All rejected." Richard smiled, a predatory expression crossing his features. "They deeper. Everyone has secrets. I want everything: medical records, credit history, former relationships. Find me something I can use." Meanwhile, across the bay, Marcus and Emily sat in a small apartment. The space was cramped but meticulously organized, with potted plants occupying every available surface. Books on botany and sustainable architecture filled the shelves. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, his usual confidence subdued. "I know your world, Emily. I've worked in enough wealthy homes to understand the scrutiny you're under. Someone's going to dig into my past, and I want you to hear it from me first." Emily reached for his hand, noticing how he tensed slightly before accepting her touch. "When I was 16, he continued, I got into a car with some friends. I didn't know it was stolen. By the time I realized, it was too late. We got caught, and because I was the only one without an alibi or expensive lawyer, I took the fall." Emily listened as Marcus detailed his 6 months in juvenile detention, how it changed his perspective on life, justice, and privilege. He described the protest arrest at 19, standing up against systemic racism in his community. "This isn't just about my past," Marcus explained. "It's about understanding what you're getting into. Richard won't let this go quietly. He'll use everything he can to protect what he sees as his territory." Before Emily could respond, her phone buzzed with Richard's number. She answered on speaker, her hand tightening around Marcus's. "I'm concerned about you, Emily." Richard's smooth voice filled the room. "As your former husband and business partner, I feel obligated to warn you about the company you're keeping. Are you aware of your gardener's criminal history?" Emily's voice remained steady. "Are you having me investigated, Richard? I'm protecting our shared interests. What would the board think if they knew their CEO was romantically involved with an ex-convict?" "First," Emily countered, her business acumen sharpening her tone, "there are no shared interests anymore. Second, my personal life is not the board's concern. And third, if you ever threaten me or Marcus again, I'll have my lawyers examine every business decision you made while systematically undermining my authority during our marriage." After hanging up, Emily turned to Marcus. "I spent 15 years letting a man dictate my choices through shame and manipulation. I won't do it again." Marcus studied her face. "This won't be easy. Richard has connections, influence." "So do I," Emily replied. "And unlike Richard, I've earned mine honestly." That evening, Richard received another call from his investigator. "Sir, there's something else. While investigating Green, I found some irregularities in your own financial records. Several large transfers to offshore accounts, coinciding with the dates of major company decisions during your marriage to Mrs. Hartman." Richard's face paled. His plan to expose Marcus was backfiring, threatening to unveil his own carefully hidden secrets. He realized that in his obsession with investigating Marcus, he left himself vulnerable to scrutiny. The investigator continued, unaware of Richard's discomfort. "Sir, should I continue the investigation? It might draw attention to..." "Stop everything," Richard snapped, hanging up abruptly. He stood at his office window, watching the fog roll in over the bay, realizing that his attempt to control Emily's life might cost him everything he'd manipulated to achieve. Catherine Hartman arranged to meet her daughter at the exclusive San Francisco Women's Club, a fortress of old money and social gatekeeping where she'd held membership for 3 decades. The oak-paneled dining room buzzed with subtle whispers as Emily walked in. News of her relationship with Marcus had already circulated through their social circle. "You're causing quite a stir," Catherine said by way of greeting, not bothering to stand as Emily took her seat. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and strand of inherited pearls represented everything Emily had once thought defined class. "I'm running a successful technology company, Mother. My personal life shouldn't be the topic of conversation." "Don't be naive, Emily. Everything is connected in our world. The Prescotts have already withdrawn their daughter's invitation to your annual charity gala. The Hendersons are reconsidering their investment in your new tech initiative." Emily felt her chest tighten, but kept her expression neutral. "If they're basing business decisions on who I'm dating, they're not investors I want." Catherine's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Dating? Is that what you're calling this public spectacle? Your father would be mortified if he were alive to see this." "Dad taught me to judge people by their character," Emily countered. "Marcus has more integrity than most people in this room." "Integrity doesn't maintain social position, Emily. Richard, despite his faults, understood our world. He could navigate board rooms and charity functions. What will you do when you need to attend the governor's ball? Bring your gardener in his work boots?" Marcus has a master's degree in environmental science that he earned while working full-time. He's starting his own sustainable landscape architecture firm. Not that any of this should matter. Catherine's perfectly lined lips tightened. "I'm giving you an ultimatum, Emily. End this inappropriate relationship, or I'll be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" "I sit on the boards of 3 companies your firm does business with. I have considerable influence with the people you need to maintain your position. Don't force my hand." Emily stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Several heads turned their way. "You're so concerned about maintaining position that you've forgotten about maintaining humanity. Goodbye, Mother." Despite her outward confidence, Emily's hands shook as she drove home. Her mother's threats weren't idle. Catherine Hartman's influence ran deep in their social circles. When Emily arrived home, she found Marcus sitting on the front steps of her house, his expression troubled. "We need to talk," he said, standing as she approached. Inside, Marcus paced the living room. "I've been offered a major landscaping contract in Seattle. A year-long project designing sustainable gardens for a new eco-friendly housing development." Emily felt her stomach drop. "When did this offer come in?" "This morning. The developer specifically requested me, citing my work here and my environmental science background." He paused. "It seems too convenient." "Mother," Emily whispered, understanding dawning. "She's trying to remove you from the equation." "Maybe she's right," Marcus said quietly. "Your life was complicated enough after Richard. I'm just adding another layer of difficulty." "Don't do this." Emily stepped toward him, but Marcus moved back. "I care about you too much to watch your life fall apart because of me. Your business, your social standing, your family. Those things aren't my life, they're my circumstances. You're the first real thing I've felt in years." But Marcus had made his decision. He left that evening, leaving Emily alone in her perfectly manicured garden that now felt like a monument to everything she was losing. The next week passed in a blur of business meetings and sleepless nights. Emily threw herself into work, avoiding her mother's calls and Richard's knowing smirks at charity functions. But each evening, she found herself in the garden, remembering how Marcus had taught her about patience, growth, and resilience. On the 8th day, Emily made a decision. She'd spent her entire life living up to other people's expectations. Her mother's social standards, Richard's controlling demands, society's narrow definitions of success. Following Marcus's example of quiet strength, she began to formulate a plan that would either cost her everything or finally set her free. Emily found Marcus at a small nursery in Oakland where he'd been working temporarily before his planned move to Seattle. The morning fog still clung to the rows of plants as she walked through the gate, her designer heels impractical on the gravel paths. "I'm not letting you leave," she said without preamble. Marcus looked up from the seedlings he was tending, his hands covered in soil. "Emily, no, let me finish. I've spent the past week thinking about fear, about how it controlled my marriage to Richard, how it drives my mother's every decision, and how it's controlling us now." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on his work pants. Other nursery workers pretended not to watch their exchange. "Your fears are valid," Emily continued. "The prejudice is real. The social and business implications are real. But you know what else is real? The fact that I'm tired of living my life based on other people's limitations." "It's not that simple," Marcus argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, it is. I'm going to the Hamilton's charity gala tomorrow night. It's the biggest social event of the season. Every power player in San Francisco will be there, including my mother and Richard. I want you to come with me." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's exactly the kind of situation we should avoid. Your mother. My mother needs to understand that I'm not her puppet anymore. Richard needs to see that his manipulation has no power over me. And I need to know if you're willing to fight for us as hard as I am." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of a water sprinkler activating in a distant greenhouse. "If we do this," Marcus said slowly, "there's no going back." "Your world, our world," Emily corrected. "And maybe it needs to change." They spent the next hour sitting among the plants, having the conversation they should have had days ago. Marcus shared his deepest fears, not just about society's judgment, but about the weight of being seen as the reason for Emily's potential downfall. Emily spoke about her terror of repeating patterns, of choosing safety over authenticity. "I haven't told you everything," Marcus admitted. "That Seattle offer? I did some digging. The development company is a subsidiary of one of your mother's friends' corporations. The whole thing was orchestrated to get me out of the picture quietly." Emily laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Of course it was. Mother always preferred subtle manipulation to direct confrontation. Richard taught her that." "Speaking of Richard," Marcus hesitated. "My friend who works as a paralegal. She found something interesting about his financial dealings during your marriage." Emily leaned forward. "Tell me everything." As Marcus explained what he'd discovered, Emily's expression shifted from surprise to understanding to determination. By the time they finished talking, the fog had burned away, leaving a clear, bright day. "So," Emily said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt, "will you be my date to the gala?" Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. "You realize this is more than just a date. This is a declaration of war." "No, Emily corrected. This is a declaration of independence. Are you with me?" Marcus stood, making his decision. "I'll need a tuxedo. I know a good tailor." Emily smiled. "And Marcus, thank you for not giving up on us." As they left the nursery together, Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Looking forward to seeing you at the gala tomorrow. We need to discuss the company's future." Emily showed the message to Marcus. "He's planning something." "So are we," Marcus replied, his hand finding hers. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the gala, both understanding that tomorrow night would either destroy everything they'd built or become the foundation for something stronger than social expectations and prejudice could touch. In her office across town, Catherine Hartman received confirmation that Marcus had not yet accepted the Seattle position. She picked up her phone, ready to apply more pressure, then stopped as she remembered the last time she'd seen her daughter truly happy, at age 12, before social expectations had begun to shape her every decision. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone to examine their own prejudices, fears, and definitions of love. The Hamilton's annual charity gala transformed the San Francisco Opera House into a glittering showcase of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast elegant shadows across marble floors as the city's elite arrived in designer gowns and custom tuxedos. Emily's Aston Martin pulled up to the entrance, causing a subtle stir among the waiting guests. The stir turned to obvious shock when Marcus stepped out first, walking around to open her door. Emily emerged in a sleek black Valentino gown, her arm sliding naturally through Marcus's. His tuxedo, perfectly tailored that afternoon, fit him as well as any of the old money heirs lounging by the entrance. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. "Well, a familiar VO. Ice cut through the murmurs. This is certainly an interesting choice of escort." Richard stood at the top of the stairs, champagne in hand, his new girlfriend, barely 30, clutching his arm. Richard. Emily nodded coolly, guiding Marcus past him. Lovely to see you've maintained your predictability. Inside, the reactions varied from poorly concealed stares to deliberate snubs. Catherine Hartman held court near the stage, her face freezing when she spotted her daughter and Marcus. The string quartet's Mozart piece couldn't quite mask the buzz of gossip. Emily, darling, Catherine's voice carried across the room as she approached. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the guest list. No misunderstanding, Mother. Marcus is my date. Emily's voice matched her mother's in volume, ensuring nearby guests could hear. He's also the designer of the new sustainable garden project I'm announcing tonight. Catherine's perfectly maintained smile slipped. Tonight? But Richard is supposed to present the company's new direction. Change of plans, Emily interrupted. The board approved my proposal yesterday. We're going green, Mother, starting with a complete redesign of our corporate campuses. Marcus stood quietly beside Emily, his presence both a challenge and a statement. He'd faced prejudice before, but never quite like this. The subtle, poisonous variety that hid behind social niceties and martini glasses. Richard materialized beside them, his characteristic smirk in place. Emily, we need to talk. Privately. Anything you have to say can be said here, Emily replied. Very well. Richard's voice took on the condescending tone she knew so well. The board may have approved your little garden project, but they haven't heard about your gardener's juvenile record, or about certain financial irregularities I've discovered in your recent transactions. Marcus tensed beside her, but Emily squeezed his arm reassuringly. Interesting approach, Richard, especially considering what Marcus's paralegal friend found in your offshore accounts. Richard's smile faltered slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. The systematic embezzlement during our marriage? The falsified board meeting minutes? The shell companies? Emily stepped closer, her voice dropping. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out eventually? The color drained from Richard's face. Catherine, watching the exchange, moved closer. What's going on? She demanded. Your perfect son-in-law isn't quite what he seems, Mother, Emily said. While you were busy judging Marcus for growing up poor and working honest jobs, Richard was stealing from the company and manipulating records. You can't prove anything, Richard hissed. Actually, Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet authority. We can. The SEC is very interested in some of the documentation we've uncovered. The string quartet finished their piece, and the event coordinator announced it was time for speeches. Emily was scheduled to speak first. As she walked to the stage, she felt the weight of hundreds of judging eyes, saw the mixture of disdain and curiosity on familiar faces. Standing at the podium, Emily looked out at the crowd. She saw Richard's barely contained panic, her mother's conflicted expression, and Marcus's steady, supporting presence. In that moment, she knew exactly what she needed to say. The microphone hummed to life, and Emily began to speak, her voice strong and clear. The words she chose would either salvage or destroy her position in this glittering world of privilege. But for the first time in her life, she realized that either outcome was perfectly acceptable because she was finally speaking her truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Emily began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. We're here tonight to discuss the future, not just of my company, but of the values we claim to represent in this room. Richard shifted uncomfortably near T. He bar, his fingers drumming against his crystal tumbler. The young woman on his arm sensed his unease and took a small step away from him. For years, I've watched us congratulate ourselves on our philanthropic efforts while maintaining systems of exclusion and prejudice. Tonight, that changes. Emily's gaze swept the room. My company is launching a nationwide initiative for sustainable corporate spaces, led by one of the most innovative environmental architects I've had the pleasure to know, Marcus Green. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Catherine Hartman's hand tightened around her champagne flute. But before we discuss that project, let's address the real elephant in the room. Emily's voice hardened slightly. Many of you have spent the evening whispering about my choice of date. Some of you have made your disapproval clear. Others have already pulled investments or threatened business relationships. The whispers died down, replaced by uncomfortable silence. What none of you have done is ask about Marcus's qualifications. His master's degree in environmental science. His innovative designs that have saved clients millions in water conservation. His patents pending for sustainable irrigation systems. Emily paused, letting the information sink in. Instead, you saw what you expected to see, what your prejudices told you to see. Marcus stood near the stage, his posture straight but relaxed, emanating a quiet dignity that made several guests look away in shame. But while you were all so busy judging my personal life, you missed something far more significant. Emily clicked a remote, and the large screen behind her came to life. These are financial records from the past 5 years. Records that show systematic embezzlement, fraud, and manipulation of board decisions. Richard's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent room. "Richard," Emily continued, "would you like to explain these transactions? Or shall I have my financial team walk everyone through the details?" Richard stepped forward, his charm falling away like a discarded mask. "You're making a mistake, Emily. Think about what you're doing." "I have thought about it for weeks." She clicked to the next slide. "These are records of offshore accounts, carefully hidden during our marriage. Accounts that coincide with several major company decisions that always seem to benefit you more than our shareholders." Catherine moved through the crowd toward Richard, her face ashen. "Is this true?" "It's a manipulation," Richard sputtered. "She's trying to distract from her inappropriate relationship with the help." "The help?" Marcus's voice cut through Richard's protests. "Is that how you view anyone who actually works for their success instead of stealing it?" Several prominent board members had gathered near the stage, examining the financial records displayed on the screen. Their expressions grew increasingly grave. Mrs. Hartman, one of them, called out, "These numbers, they match discrepancies our internal audit flagged last quarter." The ones Mr. Hartman insisted were accounting errors. The room erupted in conversations. Richard looked around wildly, finding former allies suddenly absorbed in their phones or turning away. His girlfriend had already disappeared into the crowd. "I'm not the one who should be worried about their reputation," Richard snarled, desperation making him reckless. "At least I'm not sleeping with the gardener." "No," Emily replied calmly. "You were too busy sleeping with your secretary, 3 of our clients' wives, and apparently now someone young enough to be your daughter. The difference is, I'm not ashamed of who I love. You're ashamed of who you are." Catherine Hartman stepped forward, her social mask cracking for the first time in decades. "I helped you," she said to Richard, her voice shaking. "I defended you. I tried to separate my daughter from some, one I thought wasn't good enough for her, while you—" She turned to Emily, tears in her eyes. "I was wrong. About everything." 2 men in dark suits appeared at the entrance. Emily nodded to them. "Those would be the SEC investigators. Richard, I believe they have some questions for you." As Richard was escorted from the gala, Emily stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted before her, faces showing various degrees of shock, respect, and reassessment. She walked directly to Marcus, taking his hand. "Now," she said, addressing the room again, "shall we discuss the future? The real future, where we judge people by their character and not their circumstances?" The truth had been revealed, but its impact was just beginning to ripple through the carefully maintained facade of San Francisco's high society. The gala's atmosphere transformed in the wake of Richard's departure. The previously judgmental crowd now shifted uncomfortably, many guests suddenly finding themselves on the wrong side of a moral divide they hadn't seen coming. A prominent venture capitalist was the first to approach Emily and Marcus. "Mr. Green," he said, extending his hand, "I understand you have some innovative ideas about sustainable corporate landscapes. My firm would be very interested in hearing your proposals." Before Marcus could respond, another guest stepped forward. "Richard told me to pull my investment last week because of, well," the man glanced uncomfortably between Emily and Marcus. "I'd like to reinstate my commitment and possibly increase it." Emily watched as the social current shifted, noting how quickly people could change allegiances when the winds of power changed direction. Marcus squeezed her hand, recognizing the same pattern. "Funny how quickly prejudice fades when there's money to be made," he murmured in her ear. A small group of women who had been whispering with Catherine all evening approached. Their leader, Barbara Winchester, spoke first. "Emily, darling, we've been discussing the annual charity board positions. We think it's time for some fresh perspectives. Would you consider taking the chairmanship?" Emily smiled politely. "Thank you, Barbara, but I believe that position would be better filled by someone with experience in actual charitable work, not just planning parties." She turned to Marcus. "Didn't you mention your friend Maria runs that successful urban farming program in Oakland?" Barbara's face fell slightly. "Oh, well, I suppose we could consider. She's transformed 3 food deserts into sustainable community gardens," Marcus added. "Created jobs for 50 local residents. I'm sure she'd have some valuable insights about effective charitable giving." Across the room, a commotion drew attention. Richard's former assistant had arrived, clutching a USB drive and looking nervous. "I have more documents," she announced to the cluster of board members. "Records Mr. Hartman asked me to alter. Emails he had me delete. I kept copies of everything." The board members huddled around her, their expressions growing increasingly serious. One of them made a phone call, speaking in urgent tones about emergency meetings and press statements. Catherine Hartman watched this scene unfold, then turned to her daughter. "I spent so many years believing in the importance of maintaining appearances," she said quietly. "I never stopped to question what we were actually maintaining." Before Emily could respond, her phone buzzed with a news alert. The story had broken. Richard's arrest was already hitting the financial news sites, along with preliminary reports of the fraud investigation. The room buzzed as other guests received the same notifications. Emily, a reporter who had been covering the charity event, approached, phone in hand. "Would you care to comment on the allegations against Richard Hartman?" "My company is focused on the future," Emily replied smoothly. "We're excited to announce our new Sustainable Infrastructure initiative, which will revolutionize corporate campus design while creating jobs and environmental benefits for local communities." She gestured to Marcus. "Our head of environmental design can provide more details." Marcus stepped forward, handling the impromptu interview with natural grace and expertise. The reporter's initial skepticism faded as Marcus outlined the technical aspects of the project, his knowledge and passion evident in every word. More guests gathered to listen, including several who had snubbed them earlier. Emily noticed how their expressions shifted from condescension to surprise to genuine interest as Marcus spoke. Even Catherine seemed captivated by his vision for transforming urban spaces. "Your mother keeps staring at us," Marcus noted between conversations. "She's reevaluating her life choices," Emily replied. "It's about time." The evening continued to evolve, with groups forming and reforming as the social order reasserted itself around new realities. Those who had been Richard's strongest allies found themselves subtly isolated, while others rushed to align themselves with Emily's ascendant star. Yet beneath the surface adaptations, real changes were taking place. Emily overheard conversations about diversity in board appointments, about examining investment patterns in underserved communities, about the role of social responsibility in business decisions. "They're all going to claim they supported us from the beginning," Marcus observed as another former critic approached with an enthusiastic business proposal. "Let them," Emily replied. "As long as they're forced to actually change, I don't care about their motivations." The truth had shattered more than Richard's reputation. It had cracked the foundation of their entire social structure. And through those cracks, something new was beginning to grow. The day after the gala, Emily and Marcus sat in her garden, sharing a quiet breakfast as news alerts continuously buzzed on their phones. The morning papers had splashed Richard's arrest across their front pages, with headlines ranging from "Tech CEO arrested in major fraud investigation" to "Society marriage scandal reveals corporate corruption." "Your stock is actually up," Marcus noted, scrolling through his phone. "The market seems to think removing Richard from the equation is good for business." Emily sipped her coffee, watching a hummingbird visit the flowers they'd planted together months ago. The board called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They want to discuss corporate restructuring. "Are you worried?" "No," Emily smiled. "For the first time in years, I'm not worried about anything." Her phone rang, Catherine calling for the 3rd time that morning. This time, Emily answered. "Mother." Emily, I've been thinking all night. Catherine's voice sounded different. Less controlled, more human. I need to tell you something about your father. Emily sat straighter. What about him? Before he married me, he was engaged to someone else. A teacher from Oakland. My parents, they did what I did to you. They pressured him, threatened to cut him off, told him she wasn't good enough. Catherine paused. He gave her up, married me instead. But he never forgave himself. Or them. Or me, I think. Marcus squeezed Emily's hand as she processed this revelation. Why are you telling me this now? Because I almost made you repeat our mistakes. Because I watched you stand up last night and do what your father never could. Because. Catherine's voice cracked slightly. Because I'm proud of you. After the call ended, Emily sat in silence for a moment. She's never said that before. That she's proud of me. The afternoon board meeting proved surprisingly straightforward. With Richard's fraud exposed and Emily's leadership during the crisis praised by investors, the board voted unanimously to remove all traces of Richard's influence from the company. They also approved Emily's full environmental initiative, with Marcus's firm given primary oversight of the project. We need to discuss the PR strategy, one board member suggested. Given recent events, Emily interrupted, I suggest we focus on actions rather than appearances. Our priority should be implementing these changes effectively, not managing public perception. As they left the meeting, Emily's assistant handed her a note. Richard's former girlfriend, wanted to meet. She says she has more information about his dealings. Set it up, Emily nodded. And contact Maria about that charity board position. It's time for real change, not just symbolic gestures. That evening, Emily and Marcus walked through the garden that had brought them together. The paths they designed together wound through native plants and drought-resistant flowers, a testament to both beauty and practicality. I received 12 job offers today, Marcus mentioned casually. Suddenly, everyone wants a sustainable landscape architect. And I turn them all down. We're building something here, something bigger than garden designs or corporate campuses. We're changing how people think about worth, about value, about who belongs where. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. Speaking of belonging, move in with me. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Your mother might have a heart attack. My mother will adapt. She's learning too. As if on cue, Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Having Maria over for tea tomorrow to discuss her urban farming initiative. Would you and Marcus like to join us? They both laughed at the timing. It won't all be this easy, Marcus cautioned. Some people won't change. The prejudices run deep. I know, Emily agreed. But we've created a crack in their perfect world. And through that crack, light gets in, change gets in. They continued their walk, discussing plans for the future, both personal and professional. The garden around them, once a symbol of rigid social expectations, had become something else, a testament to growth, to change, to the beauty that comes from breaking down old barriers and nurturing new possibilities. The sun set over San Francisco Bay, casting long shadows through the trees they'd planted together. In the growing dusk, the boundaries between the carefully manicured lawn and the wild, natural growth beyond seemed to blur, suggesting a new kind of harmony, one that embraced both order and freedom, tradition and change, past and future. 3 months after the gala, Emily sat in her office reviewing the quarterly reports when her assistant rushed in with breaking news. Richard's company, the one he'd maintained separate control over during their marriage, was facing bankruptcy. Years of mismanagement and hidden financial manipulation had finally caught up with the business. He's requesting a meeting, her assistant said, handing over a letter. Says it's urgent. Emily studied the letter, noting how Richard's usually confident handwriting now seemed shaky. Set it up for tomorrow. And call Marcus. He should be there. The next morning, Richard entered Emily's office looking notably different from his usual polished self. His designer suit hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Marcus was already there, standing quietly by the window. You've lost weight, Emily observed neutrally. Prison tends to have that effect, Richard replied, attempting his old sarcasm, but failing. I'm out on bail, pending the trial. Why are you here, Richard? He sank into a chair, his facade crumbling. The company's failing. Over 300 employees will lose their jobs. I know I have no right to ask, but these people are innocent. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. Emily and Marcus exchanged looks. This was a side of Richard they'd never seen. Genuine concern for others. What exactly are you asking for? Marcus asked. Buy the company? Richard said simply. You have the resources, Emily. You understand the industry. The employees trust you. Many of them worked with you before our divorce. Emily leaned back in her chair. And what do you get out of this? Nothing. I've forfeited my shares as part of the plea deal with the SEC. Richard's voice cracked slightly. I need to do one right thing before they send me away. Love blossoms between a wealthy woman and her gardener, but her ex-husband's scheme for revenge spirals out of control. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. After Richard left, Emily pulled up the company's financial records. He's right about one thing. Those employees don't deserve to lose everything because of him. Marcus studied the numbers over her shoulder. The core business is still solid. The problems all stem from Richard's financial manipulations. With proper management, we could transform it, Emily finished. Convert the office parks to sustainable spaces, implement green technologies, create something meaningful from Richard's mess. The decision was made. Emily called an emergency board meeting, presenting a proposal to acquire Richard's failing company. The board, seeing the potential for both profit and positive PR, approved the purchase. When the news broke, the media painted it as a story of redemption. The wronged ex-wife saving her former husband's legacy. But Emily saw it differently. This wasn't about saving Richard's legacy. It was about creating something new from the ashes of the old. The transformation began immediately. Marcus's team started redesigning the corporate campuses, incorporating community gardens and sustainable technologies. Emily's mother, Catherine, surprisingly emerged as a strong advocate, using her social connections to promote the environmental initiatives. A month later, Emily received another unexpected visit from Richard's former girlfriend. I've been thinking about what you did, she said, fidgeting with her purse. Taking over the company, saving those jobs, it made me realize something. I want to do more with my life than just be someone's arm candy. Emily studied the young woman thoughtfully. What's your background? Environmental engineering. Actually, I never finished my degree because Richard, he said I didn't need to work. That afternoon, Emily created a new corporate scholarship program for employees and their families to complete their education. The first recipient was Richard's ex-girlfriend. The final piece fell into place when Richard's sentencing arrived. Emily attended the hearing, surprising everyone by speaking on his behalf. She didn't excuse his actions, but acknowledged his final attempt to protect his employees. The judge, considering all factors, sentenced Richard to 5 years in prison plus restitution. As he was led away, Richard caught Emily's eye and nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Later that evening, in their garden, Emily and Marcus celebrated with a quiet dinner under the stars. You know what's ironic? Emily mused. Richard's greatest fear was losing control, losing his position in society. In trying to maintain that control, he lost everything. But in losing everything, he finally found his humanity. Marcus raised his glass to unexpected transformations and to the power of forgiveness, Emily added. Not for the one forgiven, but for the one who forgives. As they sat together, surrounded by the garden they'd nurtured and the life they'd built, Emily realized that true power wasn't in controlling others or maintaining appearances. It was in the ability to grow, to change, and sometimes to find beauty in the most unexpected places. The story that began with a painful divorce had transformed into something larger, a testament to the possibility of change, the power of authenticity, and the triumph of love over prejudice. In the end, every character had been transformed, not just Emily and Marcus, but Richard, Catherine, and even the society they inhabited. And in their garden, where it all began, new flowers continued to bloom, reminding them that from every ending springs a new beginning.